Good morning, my beautiful baby-bats! I'm your resident active advocate, and it's sunny out, and it's warm out, and I got to watch Mulan for today's movie discussion. Today, I would like to talk to you about Mulan and racism. This is ground that I have covered before in the Aladdin video, if you've seen that, because upon this current viewing that I just had, I realized that Mulan is not, in the way it is presented here, is not a Chinese story, shall we say, even though the original poem came out of ancient China. Mulan, as presented by Disney, is the Westernized version of a Chinese narrative. The poem itself, go find it online, it's very short. It doesn't give you any more information than Mulan, who is a girl, goes to fight in war to save her father. That's all the information you get out of this poem, okay? I do believe that the movie is set during the Han Dynasty, which was among China's most prosperous dynasties in the ancient kingdoms period. You know, you had the Great Wall up. You had China itself united under the rule of a single emperor. This was quite rare in Chinese history, okay? Go look at ancient Chinese history. It's actually very, very interesting. But one of the common themes of this kingdom or these kingdoms is that they would fall apart, they would splinter, they would be under the rule of many different dynasties at many different times. There would be a lot of internal war, civil war, war between different factions in China. And in Mulan, China is a unified entity for 5 minutes in its history. To be fair, a lot of the unified dynasties would last upwards of, like decades, even several centuries at a time, sometimes, depending on the family in power. But the Great Wall itself went up, just for a little bit of context here, it went up during the rule of Emperor Qin, Qin, in ancient Chinese, okay? But we would pronounce it as Qin, the Qin dynasty, which is where we get the word China to begin with. Ancient China, to be frank, was a rather rigidly stratified nation, when you could call it a single nation, okay? There would be, primarily because of Confucianism, which is a religion and philosophy endemic to China itself, there would be a great divide between the genders, okay? Male on one side of things, female on the other side of things, and according to Confucius, in the Westernized version of the name, it's Confucius, right? That's the Greekified version of the name. But according to Confucius, you would have, if you were a male, here were your roles. If you were a female, here were your roles. There was more than one for each of the genders, depending on where you stood on the spectrum, because in ancient Chinese, in the language itself, they don't distinguish with gender binaries. They don't have the words for male and female or he and she, the pronouns and such. But as filtered through the Western perception in the motifs created by Disney, the divide that was there due primarily to Confucianism, which, by the way, was a unifying force for the nations becoming one nation. They sort of conglomerated under the edicts of Confucianism and Daoism, but it's much more Confucian in this movie. You would have prescribed gender roles, as I say, but through the Westernized narrative, these are brought very, very, very highly into prominence. The reason why I'm not going to talk about Mulan and gender is because I see the narrative itself as being too heavily emphasized by the racialized motifs brought to this story by Disney. As I say, in the original poem, the only context you get, Mulan is a girl, Mulan goes to fight for her father in the war. All right? That's it. When it comes to this movie, though, the whole idea of Chinese culture as portrayed for us is one of the honor-shame dichotomy. To be fair, in the East, and well, the East, okay, we're going into Orientalism territory here. So this is not the global East. This is the Orient or the East as perceived by the West. You did, especially much more in ancient times, but even nowadays, you did have a great dichotomy of the honor versus the shame motifs, because these were and still continue to be much more collectivist societies than we have here in the West. The West, again, not the global West. I'm talking about the conquering West, the perception of the West from itself, from within, and from those who rule it. We are individuals. We are meant to be individuals. This is my life. This is my job. This is what I am doing. These are my priorities. Whereas in the East, and much more since before it was more open to the West, you would get whole societies where children would be raised by the collective. You would get whole societies where if you did something wrong as an individual, it would reflect negatively on your entire family and especially on your parents. So there is a great motif in this movie of, I must in this way bring honor to my family. I actually did an honor count, which is I counted how many times they used the word honor in the movie. Outside of the song Honor to Us All, they use the word at least 18 different times. In Honor to Us All, you get an additional 11 times. So that is 29 times in total. This movie is an hour and 20 minutes long. So on average, it's more than once every 10 minutes. Go through the movie and count for yourself, because it's interesting how many times they use that word, especially when it's not even in the collectivist context. You know, you see Mushu dressing down Mulan, dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow, dishonor on everything, right? And she's like, stop, 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 right? But it would not have been out of the question to assume that Mulan's actions would reflect badly on her family, even if she weren't discovered as a female, because at some point that secret would have come out. And regardless of whether she were successful in the army, that would have reflected very negatively on her family, because not only did she break the law of the time, but it was also very masculine work. This was outside of the prescribed roles for a female in that time period, in that culture. But through the westernized filter of this movie, that is much more heavily emphasized than maybe it even would have been historically speaking. In the narrative of the movie, even in the visuals, there is a great distinction made between the female world and the male world. I'm talking just pure color psychology here, okay? In the female world, you see this on its fullest display in the musical number Honor to Us All. You see a lot of flowing garments. You see a lot of pink. You see a lot of bright colors. You see makeup. You see dresses. You see parasols. You see elegance. You see, even walking a certain way, holding your hands a certain way. It's all very rigid and tight and controlled and colorful. It is femininity at its absolute maximum level in this cultural context. Contrastingly, when you get to Mulan posing as a soldier, you get aggression on display. You get rudeness on display. She even says of the men, Mushu says to her, hey, isn't this beautiful? She's like, they're disgusting. He says, no, they're men, and you're going to have to act just like them, so pay attention. But there's no shame over being, well, basically animalistic as a male. And that comes through the Western perception as well, because the whole idea of young men, of soldiers, especially being permitted to be, without manners, without any kind of etiquette, to be boorish, to have no restraints whatsoever, that would not have been permitted within a Confucian society. You see Shang taking head of the army and saying, soldiers, pay attention, smarten up, stop being boys, stop acting like a bunch of idiots or you're all going to get killed. They would have, going into the army, already known this. Their upbringing as Confucians, as Buddhists, as Taoists, because all three of these religions play a major role in Chinese history, they would have been much more under self-control, historically speaking. So it would have been more analogous to the female world of the rigid self-control. You must not cause a stir. You must always be sort of in the background. But that would have been the case with the soldiers as well, because they would have been under the command of Shang, who's at the head of this army, and also of, I believe his name is Chifu, the advisor to the emperor, who sort of has his eye on Shang for the entire duration of the training montage. But another thing in the masculine world, too, is the lack of color. You see very earthy colors, for one thing, but even the armor that the men wear, the clothing that the men wear, it's all very muted colors. So it's sort of like we get to stand out through our behavior, not through our attire. Whereas on the female side of things, we stand out only through our attire, not through our behavior, because one of the very first mandates that Mulan is given when she is being trained to be a bride is to be silent. Always to be silent. You are the one taking orders. You are the one who obeys. You are the one in the background. That would not have been the case in a society, as I say, that was mandated by Confucianism, because in Confucianism, it's not that females are seen as inferior to males, and they do have a very stable, very emphasized role in society. Confucianism, the whole entire idea behind the philosophy itself, is to keep society together through the practice of filial piety. Filial piety has mostly to do with the family, but extends to the community, extends to the royalty, extends to the aristocracy, and inevitably, at the higher scale, to the world. The whole idea of this movie is that we are putting the Western conceit of this culture on top of it to tell a Westernized version of this story, and to make the divide extraordinarily rigid, to make the divide between the sexes extraordinarily emphasized. It's like, thou shalt and thou shalt not. And you cannot go outside of that prescribed role. Thing is, that's a very modern conception as well. Isn't that what capitalism says? Capitalism is a very new invention of the West, comparatively speaking, and it pretty much says you are born into this. You can basically do only this. The only way in which you will gain upward mobility is through money. They project that onto this movie in the sense of the only way Mulan can gain upward mobility is through a good marriage. The whole conceit of the song Honor to Us All. A girl can bring her family great honor in one way, by striking a good match. And this could be the day. That's one of the verses, or pop up, sorry, hang on. But the whole idea there is that you have one prescribed role, you will never go outside that role, and if you attempt to, society will either ignore your attempt or will beat your attempt down. You see that more towards the end of the movie when her identity as a female is revealed to the army and they're on the verge of putting her to death. I don't know whether in ancient Chinese culture that would have been the case, that if you were found to be a female cross-dressing to do, quote, men's work, whether you would actually be put to death. Or would she just be sent home? We don't know, because the movie doesn't address that question. The movie doesn't address actual historical context for the most part. You do definitely see themes that could be historically accurate. Like the emperor in his speech, when they believe that the whole fighting is done, he says, "My children, heaven smiles down upon the Middle Kingdom." One very important aspect of ancient Chinese folk religion, this was even before Confucianism was introduced into the mix, but was something called the mandate of heaven. If an emperor, if a ruler, if a family, if a nation, if the world retains the mandate of heaven, so the favor of the gods, basically, then that world, that country, that emperor, even just that family, they will be prosperous and successful. But one of the stipulations here, too, was that if you lose the mandate of heaven, you're going to be walked on by external forces, by invasion, by family breakdown. And you see this reflected in the movie, though, in a rather controversial way, in that Mulan steps outside of the edicts set forth for her by her family. Because, her parents are always saying, be this way, be this one way, bring honor to your family in this one way. Because that is to maintain a legacy. And the whole idea of the mandate of heaven was that if you are a good boy, good girl, good whatever, your legacy will last. And you'll be able to maintain your rule, you'll be able to maintain your prosperity indefinitely, so long as you don't go against the gods, so long as you don't go against heaven. Mulan goes against every societal norm that is set forth for her by joining the army, by doing men's work, right? And she's good at it. That's the thing. So one of potentially dozens of narratives in this movie is the whole idea of gendered work, of this work belongs to this sex, this work belongs to this sex, don't go outside of that, as I've said, right? But for the people who do, and who don't find themselves comfortable in one realm, but do find themselves comfortable in the other, that's where the Taoist narrative in this movie comes in. I'm drawing in the air, but you've seen the symbol of the yin-yang in Daoism, in contrast to Confucianism. And it's strange that both of these philosophies existed in such harmony in ancient China. But in Daoism, one was meant to move back and forth between roles, between, divisions in society. Not that necessarily you could, quote, be a man one day and the next day, quote, be a woman, right? It wasn't like that, but it was much more fluid. You were allowed to do different things with your time. Basically, the whole edict was go with the flow and do what you're good at, because that is the best way, overall to maintain the heavenly orders. So when it comes to Mulan actually being much better at gendered male work than she is at gendered female work, then according to Taoism, that would help you to maintain heaven's, divine favor. But Taoism and Confucianism show a bit of a struggle between one another in this movie. And I don't know whether the movie makers were even aware of what they were doing at times, because it's very Confucian in one minute and it's very Taoist in the next. But overall, the narrative is meant to be Confucian because of the whole idea of filial piety and of staying within your prescribed role. But it is Confucianism through the Westernized lens. And the Western lens is even worse on this because the whole idea of stepping outside of the gender binary, that's very new to us. in ancient Chinese culture, that was, as I say, permitted. They didn't have gendered pronouns, he, she, that sort of thing in ancient Chinese. Probably in modern dialects like Mandarin, Cantonese, they might, but I would actually have to research into that. The whole idea here is that it is very old concepts being seen through the comparatively new Western lens. You have to remember that China, both as a divided and as a united nation, is thousands of years older than the West as an entity. You know, China was around before we were even thought of. The Greco-Roman idea of what the world should be like, that is in its infancy compared to China. Because China got its start as like a proto-kingdom, shall we say, right around the same time as Mesopotamia. So about 3000 BCE. Do the math, that's been about 5,000 years. Just a little over 5,000 years, which is pretty impressive. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of culture, there's a lot of identity, there's a lot of just everything packed into this one little art piece of a movie. And as I say, I really like this movie, but at the same time, there's a lot of really negative readings that can be put into this movie. But then again, there's a lot of really positive narratives that can be put into this movie. And I think that one of the main reasons why I like this movie so much is its flexibility. Oh my God, is it flexible? If you want a really complex narrative that you can really dig your teeth into, watch this movie again and watch for certain things. As I say, the color motifs, the behavioral motifs, like if you are a man, you are meant to be emphasized. If you are a woman, you are not meant to be emphasized. If you are anything in between, and there have been arguments made that Mulan may be gender non-binary, she may be transgender. There have been arguments made in that vein, but in ancient Chinese culture, that was permitted. Not only was it permitted, but in some cases it was actually honored. Whereas because this movie is being seen through the Westernized lens and seen as a Oriental art piece, that through our lens is not permitted. I would advise you all, and trust me, this is not even tangential, this is what I'm talking about, to look up the figure of Kuan Yin. Q-U-A-N, new word, yin, Y-I-N, okay? They were a bodhisattva of early Mahayana Buddhism, which got its start, by the way, in China. And they're a very interesting figure, and you'll notice that I don't use a gender binary term because they did not fit into our idea of a binary. And their history is very interesting as well. And even currently in China, they are recognized as, if not even a bodhisattva, which, by the way, is like one on their way in Buddhism, one on their way to enlightenment, but who chooses to stay unenlightened, who chooses to stay mortal in order to benefit other people. Kuan Yin is recognized in that context, but they are also recognized as a deity in and of themselves, which is really, really cool. And I advise you all to look into their story because it will give you a much more concrete idea of where ancient Chinese culture comes from in terms of the gender binary. So this was as much a video lecture on gender and gender roles as it was about Mulan and racism. But as I say, this movie is coming at the very ancient, very complex Chinese culture through the infantile, westernized lens. Comparatively infantile, okay? We haven't been going for as long as they have. So that is my analysis of Mulan, but that's only one analysis of potentially dozens, as I say, that you could put onto this movie. There are so many different ways, and another reason why I like this, there are so many different ways to read a good piece of art. This movie is a good piece of art. Read it and weep. Read it and laugh. Read it and get angry. Read it and do a lot of things. Because read. Not only in words, but also in context. That is my advice to you for today. Also to look up the story of Kuan Yin, because they are awesome. And I will see you all tomorrow. The next movie on the lineup is technically Tarzan. I don't know whether I want to talk about that, but I might even talk about it from the context of the book rather than the context of the movie. Because the book is very, very, very different from the movie. Though the movie does take some inspiration from the book. So I will see y'all tomorrow to talk potentially about that, potentially about something else. We will find out together. And have a lovely, wonderful day. Mwah!